In 1825, a London chemist held up a glass retort. Inside were a few oily drops from a gas lamp, a leftover nobody wanted. It smelled sweet, almost floral, like a greenhouse in winter. He called it bicarbonate of hydrogen. We call it benzene. That sweet smell promised progress, dyes, perfumes, medicines, gasoline. But the same molecule that smelled like spring was quietly rewriting the bone marrow of the people who handled it. The nose cannot detect a carcinogen. The body does not send a warning when a stem cell fails. The first clue came from Italian shoemakers in the 1920s. Their gums bleeding, their blood counts falling. Then from rotogravure printers. Then from a Dow Chemical study filed away in 1948. The knowledge was there, sealed in a drawer, locked in a corporate archive. This is the deep archive. We leave the noisy surface where benzene still smells sweet, where the fumes at a refinery fence line carry a century of unacknowledged contracts. The hatch seals. Black water closes around the vessel. Below, in the dark, we find the retort, the dream of a snake eating its own tail, the study that was never published, and the small white blood cells that vanish one by one. The archive holds the evidence, and the descent begins. The flame in Faraday's retort has been extinguished for nearly 200 years, but the residue remains. Imagine a room in London, 1825. The gas lights are low, hissing softly, burning whale oil that has been cracked and distilled into something luminous. On a bench sits a glass retort, and inside it, a residue. Not much to look at. A few oily drops, clinging to the curved surface like the memory of a lamp that burned too long. The chemist who made it, Michael Faraday, had been experimenting with a compressed oil from gaslighting, something nobody else wanted, a leftover. He collected it, heated it, and obtained a clear liquid. It smelled nothing like the greasy tallow of the lamps. It smelled sweet, almost floral, like something from a greenhouse in the dead of winter. He called it bicarbonate of hydrogen. We call it benzene. The smell is the first clue. It seems innocent, pleasant even. A perfume of the new industrial age. But the nose is not a good instrument for detecting danger. The body's earliest warning system evolved for rotting meat, not for molecules that smell like wisteria while slowly reordering the bone marrow. That gap between what we sense and what we suffer is the territory this story will occupy. Faraday's discovery was dutifully recorded in the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society, a dense journal with small print and long dashes. He noted the liquid stability, its reluctance to react, its strange consistency. But he did not know its shape. That would take another man, another country, another 40 years, and a dream. Auguste Kekulé, a Belgian chemist working in Germany, spent the 1860s trying to make sense of benzene's molecular structure. The problem was that all known organic molecules were built like chains, linear, predictable, one carbon atom hooked to the next. But benzene did not behave like a chain. It had too many carbon atoms for the number of hydrogen atoms, and it resisted the standard reactions. Kekulé drew endless diagrams, each one wrong. Then, one evening in 1865, he dozed off by the fire. In his dream, he saw atoms gambling in a dance. They twisted into a snake, which seized its own tail and began to spin. He woke with a jolt and understood. Benzene was a ring. The image is so famous it has become a kind of scientific fairy tale. But the truth is stranger than the legend. The ring structure was not merely decorative. It explained benzene's unusual stability. The electrons looped around the circle like traffic on a closed road, never colliding, never breaking. It also opened a new branch of chemistry, aromatic compounds. Anything with a benzene ring, or several rings fused together, belonged to this fragrant family. The name itself comes from the Greek aroma, meaning spice or sweet smell. So the molecule had a pleasing scent, a pleasing shape, and suddenly, a promising future. The late 19th century was a golden age for coal tar. Gas works and coke ovens produced the black sludge in enormous quantities, and chemists realized it was not waste but wealth. From coal tar they extracted benzene, and from benzene they made dyes. The first synthetic dye, malvine, had already appeared in 1856. An accident in a London laboratory that produced a purple so vivid it became a fashion sensation. Within decades, the textile industry of Europe was swimming in aniline colors: magenta, fuchsia, alizarin red, indigo blue. Benzene was the backbone of most of them. Then came perfumes: synthetic coumarin, synthetic vanillin, synthetic wintergreen, all built on the ring. Then came pharmaceuticals: aspirin, phenacetin, sulfa drugs, all carried the signature of benzene. The little molecule that had first appeared as a faint residue in Faraday's retort was now a workhorse. It was cheap, versatile, and stable. It could be stored, shipped, poured. It evaporated quickly and left no trace, which made it ideal for cleaning, dissolving, and carrying other chemicals into fabrics, into paints, into medicines. The 1890s saw it everywhere, in the printing shops where rotogravure inks dried instantly, in the shoe factories where rubber adhesives bonded soles, in the machine shops where metal parts were degreased. The workers who handled it noticed the smell first. That sweet, almost pleasant odor clung to clothes, to hands, to the air of the workshop. Some men said it reminded them of almonds. Others said it reminded them of nothing they had ever smelled before, but they did not mind it. The sweetness became a signature. It was a smell of progress, of modernity, of a world that no longer needed to wait for the slow yield of plants and animals. Chemistry could now manufacture the scent of spring in a vat, could fix color to cotton so it would never wash out, could kill pain with a white tablet. Benzene was the hidden engine of this transformation. It was the molecule that made the new century smell like possibility. But there was a problem, and it was not hidden. It was sitting in the medical literature as early as 1897 when a French physician named Lenoir published a paper on benzene poisoning. He described workers who had used benzene-based solvents and developed a peculiar bleeding disorder, their gums swelling, their noses leaking blood, their skin covered in bruises from the smallest bump. Their blood, when examined under a microscope, showed a strange emptiness. The red cells were diminished, the white cells even more so. The bone marrow, the factory where blood cells are made, had stopped working. Lenoir called it benzene anemia. The paper was read, noted, and largely forgotten. The sweet smell continued to fill the workshops. The ring continued to spin. The decades passed, and the molecule did not change, but the number of hands that touched it multiplied. Now, consider the paradox. A substance valued for its pleasant aroma and its elegant molecular design would eventually be recognized as one of the most insidious carcinogens ever produced. Its very name, benzene, would become a shorthand for hidden toxicity, for the poison that does not announce itself, for the chemical that works in the bone marrow, the way a slow leak works in a ship's hull, quietly, invisibly, until the vessel is too full to stay afloat. The discovery did not end the story. It made the story portable. Once you have a molecule that can be made from coal tar, that can be shipped in steel drums, that can be blended into gasoline, that can be smoked in a cigarette, that can seep into groundwater, that can drift across a refinery fence. Once you have that, you have a problem that cannot be solved by a single regulation or a single lawsuit. You have a molecule that has woven itself into the infrastructure of modern life. So we begin here, in a gaslit room, with a few drops of oil that smelled like nothing in nature. We begin with the dream of a snake eating its own tail. We begin with the idea that beauty and danger can share the same chemical bond. We begin with a smell that promised progress and delivered a different kind of future altogether. The flame in the retort has been extinguished for nearly 200 years, but the residue remains. It is in the air we breathe, in the asphalt beneath our feet, in the smoke that curls from a tailpipe on a cold morning. It is still sweet, it is still invisible, and it is still counting time. It stood at the edge of the road, a single metal pump with a glass cylinder on top, the kind that had to be hand-cranked to draw the fuel up from the underground tank. The year was 1923, or thereabouts, somewhere between the end of one war and the beginning of a machine age that had not yet learned to question the air it breathed. The man who operated the pump wore a leather cap and a canvas apron stained with decades of lubricants. When he lifted the nozzle and the first stream of gasoline hit the dry earth, the smell rose like a sweet, volatile bloom, sharp, almost floral, with an edge so light and chemical that it seemed to evaporate before the nose could register its full weight. That smell was the signature of a molecule that had quietly become the backbone of industrial mobility, and nobody, least of all the man at the pump, knew that every inhalation was a small negotiation with the bone marrow. The molecule was benzene. By the early years of the 20th century, it had already escaped the laboratory and entered the ordinary economy. Its first industrial career was not as fuel, but as a solvent, a chemical servant that dissolved almost anything and then vanished without leaving a visible trace. Rubber factories used it to thin raw latex into adhesive pastes for tires and shoe soles. Machinists poured it over metal parts to strip away grease and oil, watching the grime dissolve into a clear, sweet-smelling liquid that left the surface spotless. Paint manufacturers blended it into varnishes and lacquers to speed drying time, and dry cleaning shops adopted it as a faster, cheaper alternative to the petroleum distillates they had used before. In all these settings, benzene behaved like an ideal worker, efficient, invisible, and utterly indifferent to the bodies that handled it. The vanishing act was its calling card. A worker might spill benzene on his hands at 9 in the morning. By noon, the liquid would be gone, leaving no stain, no tackiness, no evidence that it had ever been there. The only trace was the faint, sweet odor that lingered in the workshop air, and even that faded by the end of the shift. The skin had absorbed some of it, and the lungs had taken in the rest. But because nothing visible remained, the assumption was that nothing had happened. The body, after all, does not immediately protest a single exposure. It waits. It accumulates. It files the molecules away in fat tissue and bone marrow, where they begin the slow work of cellular disruption that might not announce itself for 15 years, or 20, or 30. The industrial record from those decades is remarkably quiet about health. Factory medical logs, where they survive, contain entries for cuts, burns, and the occasional fall, but nothing about the daily absorption of an aromatic hydrocarbon. The safety manuals of the 1910s and 1920s, when they mention benzene at all, focus on fire risk. The substance is highly flammable, and a single spark could turn a degreasing tank into a column of flame. The danger that moved more slowly, that had no flame and no smoke, was simply not in the ledger. The accountants who calculated the cost of production did not include a line for bone marrow failure. No one had yet drawn the correlation between the number of years a man had worked in the rubber room and the sudden, inexplicable anemia that sent him home to bleed into his sheets at night. Then came the automobile. The first gasoline engines were not particularly fussy about fuel composition, but as compression ratios rose and manufacturers began competing on power and smoothness, they discovered that certain hydrocarbons prevented the mixture from detonating prematurely, the knocking sound that drivers came to dread. Benzene was one of those hydrocarbons. Its ring structure, the same 6-carbon loop that Kekulé had dreamed into existence in 1865, resisted the sudden pressure spikes that caused knock. In the 1920s, oil companies began blending benzene into gasoline in small but significant quantities. It raised the octane rating. It made engines run quieter, and it turned every gas station into a point of departure for another kind of exposure. Tetraethyl lead would dominate the anti-knock market for the next 50 years, but benzene never fully left the fuel blend. It remained as a secondary booster, especially in high-performance grades, and later in unleaded formulations when lead was finally phased out. Every gallon of gasoline sold after the mid-1920s contained a measurable percentage of benzene. The exact fraction varied by refinery, season, and regulatory era, but the molecule was as constant as the smell that accompanied it. You could not fill a tank without letting a little benzene vapor escape into the air around the pump. You could not drive a car without benzene in the exhaust. You could not park in a garage without the sweet odor accumulating in the enclosed space, settling on the concrete floor, waiting for the next ignition. The paradox was not subtle, but it was invisible. The property that made benzene so useful, its ability to dissolve, evaporate, and leave no visible mess, was the same property that allowed it to enter the body without warning. The skin does not repel benzene, it absorbs it, because the molecule is small and lipophilic, meaning it dissolves in fat as readily as it dissolves in oil. Once inside, it travels through the bloodstream to the bone marrow, the factory where all blood cells are manufactured. There, benzene metabolites interfere with the replication of stem cells, causing chromosomal damage that can lead to aplastic anemia, myelodysplastic syndrome, and acute myeloid leukemia. The process is not a poison in the classical sense. It does not produce immediate symptoms, does not cause vomiting or convulsions or the kind of dramatic collapse that would alert a foreman. It acts like a slow edit to the genetic copy machine, introducing errors in the white blood cell line that may not manifest as disease until decades later. The warehouse workers who unloaded drums of benzene solvent in the 1910s, the mechanics who washed their hands in it because it cut grease so cleanly, the painters who thinned their enamel with it in closed rooms, none of them knew that the clear liquid they handled so casually was a carcinogen. The word itself barely existed in the medical vocabulary of the time. The first epidemiological studies linking benzene to leukemia were still years away, and the studies that had been done, like the Italian shoemakers' aplastic anemia epidemic of the 1920s and 1930s, were published in obscure medical journals in languages that few American or British industrial hygienists read. The industry that produced benzene knew more than it said, but even that knowledge was fragmentary, scattered across company reports and academic papers that gathered dust on library shelves. The full picture would not emerge until the 1970s, after 2 generations of workers had already been exposed. The filling station attendant in 1923, wiping his hands on a rag that had soaked up benzene from a leaky hose, was living inside a statistical probability that no one had yet calculated. His bone marrow was recording the exposure in a language that would only be translated when it was too late. He might have noticed that the fumes sometimes made him dizzy if he stood too close to the pump on a still day. He might have observed that the men who worked in the refinery across town seemed to age faster, to tire more easily, to develop a pale cast to their skin that no amount of sunlight could correct. But these observations did not form a pattern. They were just the texture of a working life, the small daily costs of being present where chemicals moved from one container to another. The beauty of benzene, the thing that had first charmed the chemists of the 19th century, was its molecular elegance. The ring was stable, symmetrical, and resistant to the kinds of reactions that broke other hydrocarbons apart. That same stability meant that once benzene entered the environment, it did not degrade quickly. It lingered in groundwater, in soil, in the air above industrial corridors. It became part of the background chemistry of the modern world, a constant, low-level presence that residents of refinery towns breathed as a matter of routine. The smell of gasoline at a suburban filling station was not just the smell of fuel. It was the smell of a structural commitment that society had made to a molecule whose effects it did not yet understand. By the 1940s, benzene was woven into the fuel supply so thoroughly that no realistic alternative existed. The war effort demanded high-octane aviation fuel, and benzene was one of the components that made it possible. Refineries expanded, production lines accelerated, and the molecule flowed into the bloodstream of industrial civilization at an ever-increasing rate. The workers who built those refineries, who operated the cracking towers and distillation columns, who cleaned the storage tanks with benzene-based solvents, were present at the creation of a new kind of risk. A risk that was not dramatic, not explosive, not immediately visible, but realer than anything a safety manual could describe. The air they breathed carried a future that would not arrive for decades. There is a document from the archives of Dow Chemical, dated 1948, that is often cited in the later litigation. It is a statistical analysis of benzene workers, and it shows a clear excess of leukemia deaths among employees exposed to the compound. The study was never published. It remained in the company's internal files for more than 30 years, emerging only during discovery in the lawsuits of the 1990s. The document is neither a confession nor a cover-up in the dramatic sense. It is simply a ledger page, carefully calculated, that the company chose not to share. The men who had been the subjects of that study were still alive in 1948, many of them. They went home that day and smelled the same sweet gasoline vapors rising from the parking lot, unaware that their employer had already recorded the cost of their exposure in a language that the rest of the world would not learn to read for another generation. The invisible fuel continued to flow. Gasoline stations multiplied across the continent. The hand-cranked pumps gave way to electric meters, then to self-service nozzles with automatic shutoffs. The smell of benzene became so ordinary that most people stopped noticing it, just as they stopped noticing the sound of traffic or the glow of streetlights. It was the ambient perfume of a mobile society, present, faint, and almost pleasant in small doses. The men who worked with it directly, who cleaned engine parts and mixed solvents and tested fuel blends, carried that smell on their clothes and in their hair. Their wives could tell when they came home from the refinery because the odor clung to them like a second skin. It was not an unpleasant smell for most people. It was the smell of work, of productivity, of a country moving faster than it had ever moved before. But the body keeps a different kind of record. The bone marrow does not forget. It does not forgive. It does not negotiate with the limits that occupational safety boards will eventually set, because those limits are calculated for a statistical average, a hypothetical worker who does not smoke, who does not have a predisposing genetic variation, who does not breathe additional benzene from the exhaust of the car he drives home. The body is not a statistical average. It is a specific, unfixed, accumulating history of every inhalation and every absorption. The molecule that enters the marrow today does not know which stem cell it will damage. It only knows that the damage, when it comes, will be permanent. The gasoline pump of the 1920s, with its glass cylinder and its hand-cranked mechanism, is now a museum piece. But the molecule it dispensed has not retreated into history. Benzene is still present in every liter of gasoline sold today, regulated but not eliminated. It is still in the exhaust of every car, in the air of every city, in the ambient chemistry of a world built on combustion. The smell has become fainter, diluted by reformulation and reduced limits, but it is still there, the same sweet edge that the man at the pump breathed in 1923. The difference is that now we know what it does. The knowledge has not changed the smell. It has only changed the silence. The filling station closes at midnight. The last customer pays with cash and drives away into the dark. The attendant locks the pump, pulls the canvas cover over the nozzle, and walks to his own car, a sedan with a ticking engine and a tank full of the same fuel he has spent the evening selling. He opens the door, sits behind the wheel, and for a moment before he turns the key, he breathes. The air in the cabin is cool and faintly sweet. He does not think about the molecule. He thinks about the road ahead, the hour it will take to reach home, the way the dashboard lights glow amber against the black glass of the windshield. The engine turns over. The smell of the exhaust drifts through the open window, and he pulls away, leaving nothing behind but the odor of a century that has not yet learned to count the cost of its own motion. The smell of glue and polish in a cramped shoemaker's workshop, sweat sweet and solvent sharp, the kind of sweetness that sticks to the back of the throat and does not wash out with water. Men stood hunched over wooden lasts, pulling leather tight, pressing soles into place with a solvent that evaporated before the eye could follow. It vanished. That was its virtue. A chemical that did its job and left no trace, no residue on the leather, no stain on the fingers, nothing but a faint floral note that lingered in the air like a memory of something else. The solvent was benzene. The year was 1920, or 1925, or 1930. The place was Milan, or Naples, or a small town in Tuscany where the windows stayed closed in winter and the fumes pooled near the floor. The first sign was not dramatic. A man in his 30s, a skilled craftsman, began to feel tired. Not the ordinary tiredness of long hours, but a deeper exhaustion, as if his bones were filling with sand. His gums bled when he ate bread. His skin bruised at the lightest touch. His wife noticed that his face had taken on the color of old paper. He went to a doctor who tested his blood and found almost nothing, too few red cells, too few white cells, too few platelets. Aplastic anemia, the doctor said. The bone marrow had stopped working. The man died within the year. He was not alone. In the workshops of northern Italy, a pattern emerged. Men who worked with benzene-based adhesives, men who breathed the same sweet air shift after shift, began to fill the same hospital wards with the same diagnosis. Their blood counts fell. Their marrow stopped producing. Their bodies became quiet factories of decline, each organ starved of oxygen, each breath a little harder than the last. By the 1930s, the Italian epidemiologist had assembled a case series that was hard to ignore, a clear line connecting the solvent to the destruction of the bone marrow. The link was not statistical noise, it was a signature. The strange part was not that benzene caused harm. The strange part was that the harm had a specific address. The molecule did not attack the lungs or the liver or the skin in any predictable way. It went straight to the bone marrow, the soft, spongy tissue inside the long bones where the body manufactures blood. Inside that dark, liquid factory, benzene metabolites interfere with the stem cells that give rise to red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. The process is not immediate. It takes years, sometimes decades. The damage accumulates silently, cell by cell, until the factory shuts down or, worse, mutates beyond control. The result is aplastic anemia, or acute myeloid leukemia, a cancer of the blood that grows fast and treats the body as a host it no longer recognizes. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Atlantic, a similar story was unfolding in a different trade. The rotogravure printing industry of the 1930s depended on fast-drying inks. The solvent of choice was benzene. In vast, dimly lit press rooms, workers operated machines that transferred ink from engraved cylinders to paper at high speed. The inks released a constant vapor cloud into the air. The ventilation was poor. The workers wore no masks. They did not know that the sweetness they breathed every day was a kind of compound interest. Each inhalation deposited a small debt in the marrow, to be collected later with interest. By the late 1930s, doctors in the United States began to notice clusters of severe anemia among printers. Pancytopenia, they called it, a condition where all three types of blood cells are depleted at once. The bleeding disorders followed. Men who had never been sick collapsed on the pressroom floor, their gums bleeding, their noses running with thin red fluid. Leukemia deaths rose. The medical literature accumulated cases, reports, warnings. The industry knew. The manufacturers knew. The warnings were published, presented, filed. In 1948, Dow Chemical conducted an internal epidemiological study of its own employees. The findings were statistically significant. Workers exposed to benzene had a clearly elevated risk of leukemia. The company did not publish the study. It did not share the results with regulators, or with its own workers, or with the manufacturers who continued to use benzene in adhesives, inks, degreasers, and solvents. The report was filed away. It sat in a corporate archive, bound in a folder, locked in a drawer, gathering dust for decades. By the time it surfaced, during litigation in the 1990s, the document carried the weight of a confession written in careful bureaucratic prose, but a confession that had never been spoken aloud when it mattered. This is the paradox that sits at the center of the story. The industry that first recognized benzene's toxicity did not warn its customers or its workforce. It did not pull the product from shelves. It did not redesign the formulation. Instead, it allowed the molecule to spread deeper into everyday manufacturing. Benzene went into rubber, into plastics, into gasoline, into paints, into adhesives, into cigarette smoke. The knowledge of its danger was not absent, it was accommodated. The ledger was kept, but not balanced. The workshops of Italy, the press rooms of America, the refineries of the Gulf Coast. Each site offers a version of the same scene. A man bends over his workbench. The air smells sweet. The bottle in his hand contains a solvent that will evaporate in seconds. He does not know that his bone marrow is absorbing the damage cell by cell, because the damage has no taste, no visible mark, no immediate pain. The body does not send a signal when a stem cell fails. It simply keeps sending new cells, fewer each time, until one day the supply runs out. And what came next was not a reckoning, but a continuation. The knowledge of benzene's danger did not stop its use. It only changed the terms. Occupational limits were debated, lowered, contested, and partially enforced. Lawyers built cases around latency periods that stretched 15, 20, 30 years. Corporations argued that they could not have known, despite the Italian shoemakers, despite the rotogravure printers, despite the Dow study sitting in a locked cabinet. The burden of proof shifted to the sick, who had to reconstruct their exposure histories from faint memories of workshops long closed, from pay stubs and union records, from the testimony of co-workers who had already died. The bone marrow, for its part, does not keep a diary. It holds no photographs, no logbooks, no signed affidavits. It simply accrues the consequences of what was breathed and absorbed, and then, at some unpredictable moment, it presents the bill. The smell of glue and polish in a shoemaker's workshop is still the smell of a certain kind of progress, the kind that recedes from view as soon as it is made, leaving only its product and its price. The product was a shoe, a printed page, a tire, a plastic handle, a full tank of gas. The price was written in the blood of the people who made them, and it took several decades for the invoice to arrive. By then, the workshops had closed. The men had retired or died. The solvent had long since evaporated. And benzene, still sweet, still volatile, still invisible, continued to flow into the next trade, the next bottle, the next pair of lungs, carrying its familiar scent into a future that had not yet learned to recognize the signature of what it had already signed. The soft click of a metal lighter, a sound so ordinary it barely registers. Then the small flame, the touch to the end of a cigarette, and the first deep inhale. The sweet, acrid edge of smoke fills the mouth, the throat, the lungs. It is a familiar comfort, a gesture repeated millions of times a day across the century. But comfort is not the same as safety, and the sweetness carries something else, an invisible payload, odorless within the odor, delivered without a signature. In 1971, the newly formed Occupational Safety and Health Administration, OSHA, published its first permissible exposure limit for benzene. The number was 1 part per million, not 1%, 1 part per million. That is roughly the equivalent of 1 drop of benzene in 500 gallons of water. It was a threshold so low that industry representatives argued it was technologically impossible to measure, let alone achieve. They said it would bankrupt refineries, cripple chemical plants, destroy the solvent trade. The protests were loud, detailed, and backed by years of production data. But the scientific evidence was already there, a substance that could destroy bone marrow at concentrations far lower than previously believed. OSHA held the line. The limit became law. The strange part was not that the limit was set. The strange part was that at the very moment benzene was officially acknowledged as a human carcinogen by the new regulatory apparatus, a far larger source of exposure was being lit, inhaled, and exhaled by millions of people every day. The cigarette, that small cylinder of dried tobacco leaf and paper, contained benzene in quantities that dwarfed the occupational standard. A single cigarette, burning at the tip, generates mainstream smoke carrying benzene at levels that can exceed 100 times the OSHA limit. Not over an 8-hour work shift. In the time it takes to smoke one cigarette. The mechanism is simple chemistry. Tobacco leaf, like all plant matter, contains organic compounds that undergo incomplete combustion when the cigarette burns. The heat breaks down larger molecules into smaller, volatile ones, and among the products is benzene. It is joined by other aromatic hydrocarbons, many of them carcinogenic, but benzene stands out for its potency and its persistence. The smoker inhales it directly into the lungs. From there, it crosses the alveolar membrane into the bloodstream within seconds. The body tries to metabolize it, first in the liver, then in the bone marrow. But the metabolic process itself generates reactive intermediates, benzene oxide, mucinaldehyde, that damage the DNA of stem cells. Those stem cells are the factory for all blood cells. When they are injured, the risk of acute myeloid leukemia rises. This was not unknown in 1971. The link between benzene and leukemia had been demonstrated in occupational settings for decades. The rotogravure printers, the Italian shoemakers, the Dow Chemical workers, their blood counts had told the story, and yet the cigarette remained unlabeled. No warning about benzene, no list of ingredients. The tobacco companies, like the chemical companies before them, knew that combustion generated benzene. They had the analytical data. They chose not to disclose it. The cigarette was a product of the same industrial system that produced benzene as a solvent, a fuel additive, a raw material for plastics. It was a system that understood the danger and decided to keep moving. The year 1971 also marked a high tide in American smoking. Nearly half of adults smoked. The cigarette was embedded in the culture, in offices, in restaurants, in living rooms, in television shows. It was a prop for relaxation, a marker of sophistication, a companion for thought. The smoke from all those cigarettes filled the air of enclosed spaces, and non-smokers inhaled it too. Secondhand smoke, as it came to be called, carries benzene at concentrations that, in a poorly ventilated bar, could rival the levels faced by refinery workers before the OSHA limit. The known unknown was not that benzene existed in smoke. It was that the known danger was systematically ignored in favor of a product too profitable and too habit-forming to question. The paradox has a specific shape. On one side, the regulatory apparatus, young and earnest, setting a threshold based on the best available science, fighting industry opposition, winning a landmark standard. On the other side, the same apparatus, then and for years after, having no jurisdiction over tobacco. The Food and Drug Administration did not regulate cigarettes as a drug delivery device until much later. The cigarette existed in a regulatory blind spot, a loophole shaped like a burning stick. So the OSHA limit became a laboratory standard for factories, while the cigarette became a personal benzene dispenser. The worker who came home from a refinery with a clean uniform and a compliant air sample could sit down in a smoky kitchen and inhale, in one evening, more benzene than he would encounter on the job in a week. The body does not distinguish between sources. The bone marrow does not ask whether the benzene came from a factory pipe or a cigarette filter. It only registers the damage. The stem cells, once injured, carry the mutation forward through each division. Years pass. A decade. 2 decades. Then a blood test shows something unusual. A diagnosis: acute myeloid leukemia. The latency period works for benzene as it works for the tobacco companies. By the time the disease appears, the cause is blurred. The smoker may blame genetics, bad luck. The doctor may list smoking as a risk factor, but rarely specifies benzene. The molecule itself is absent from the conversation, as invisible in the medical chart as it was in the smoke. In 1971, the very year OSHA set the limit, the U.S. Surgeon General released a report on smoking and health. It did not mention benzene. The focus was on tar, nicotine, carbon monoxide, and the accumulating evidence of lung cancer. Benzene was a footnote at best, a trace compound among hundreds. But trace compounds have a way of concentrating in the tissue over time. The leukemias that rose among smokers in the following decades are now attributable, in part, to the benzene in the smoke. Epidemiologists calculate that benzene from cigarettes accounts for a measurable fraction of adult leukemia cases. The number is not small. There is a quiet irony in the fact that the same decade that saw the first comprehensive regulation of benzene in the workplace also saw the peak of cigarette consumption. The regulatory mind, once awakened to a carcinogen, moved to contain it in one domain while leaving it free in another. It was as though a fire department had been created to extinguish one burning building while ignoring the fire next door, because the adjacent building was not technically classified as a structure. The cigarette was not a workplace. It was a personal choice. The benzene it carried was not considered an industrial exposure. It was considered a consequence of lifestyle. But the molecule itself does not respect these categories. It drifts from the cigarette into the air, into the lungs, into the blood. It settles in the marrow. It writes its own ledger, and the ledger does not care about jurisdiction. The body is not a regulatory agency. It has no exemptions, no grandfather clauses, no industry protests. It simply metabolizes what it receives, and the consequences accumulate. The latency period is not a legal statute of limitations. It is a biological delay, and when it runs out, the disease arrives without regard for whether the exposure was occupational or recreational. The known unknown, then, is not a gap in science. It is a gap in response. The science was clear enough by 1971 to justify a limit of 1 part per million. The same science could have been applied to the cigarette. It was not. The decision to treat the cigarette as a separate category, as a product outside the scope of benzene regulation, was a choice. And choices have consequences, written not in policy documents but in bone marrow biopsies and hematology reports. The lighter clicks again. The flame rises. The first deep inhale fills the chest with warmth and the familiar sweet, acrid edge. The smoke curls upward, disperses into the room, mixes with the air others will breathe. The benzene in that smoke is already crossing membranes, already beginning its work. The smoker does not know the number of parts per million, does not know that the bottle on the laboratory shelf, the one with the hazard label and the locked cabinet, contains a molecule that is now inside the body, delivered by a product that has no label at all. The known unknown persists, not because the facts are hidden, but because they are distributed unevenly across the territory of attention. The factory has a permissible exposure limit. The cigarette has none. The refinery has air sampling. The The living room has a smoke-filled silence. And the body, that final archive, records both exposures in the same language, the language of divided cells, of altered DNA, of blood that no longer remembers how to make itself properly. The sweet smell of smoke drifts through the dusk of an ordinary evening. Somewhere, a worker who spent his career in a benzene-controlled environment sits down in a kitchen where the air is blue with someone else's combustion. He does not mark the difference. The body marks it for him quietly in the marrow. The known unknown is not the failure of science. It is the failure to connect the dots once the dots are already drawn. The year 1971 made benzene official. It also made its invisibility deeper, more portable, more intimate. The cigarette became a hidden pipeline, and the pipeline ran straight into the blood. The low, constant hum of refinery pipes at dusk is not a silence. It is a sound that has been heard for so long it becomes indistinguishable from the quiet, a background frequency woven into the muscle memory of anyone who has ever lived near a petrochemical corridor. The flare stack burns off excess gas in a steady orange plume, and the smell of naphtha drifts across the chain, link fence, sweet and volatile, settling into the lungs like a promise that does not name its terms. In the towns of Port Arthur, Texas, and Baton Rouge, Louisiana, this smell has been the smell of a paycheck for 4 decades. It has also been the smell of a future that arrives only after the past has been sealed and forgotten. Latency is a word that bends time. In medicine, it describes the interval between exposure and illness, a stretch of years during which the agent does its work in silence, inside the bone marrow, inside the stem cells, inside the machinery of replication that the body never pauses to inspect. For benzene, that interval is measured not in hours or months, but in decades. 15 years is the lower boundary of the clinical literature. 40 years is not uncommon. A worker hired at 18, breathing vapors from a leaking pump seal at 23, may not feel the first fatigue, the first bruise, the first fever that will not subside until he is nearly 60. By then, his children are grown. His retirement papers are on a desk somewhere. The refinery has been sold twice, and the shift logs from 1978 are in a warehouse that no one remembers. This is the long tail of latency, and it has a legal shape. In the 1990s, a series of lawsuits began to move through federal courts in the Gulf states. Workers who had spent their careers inside Exxon refineries were filing claims for acute myeloid leukemia, a cancer of the blood and bone marrow whose link to benzene had been recognized by the International Agency for Research on Cancer since 1982, by the U.S. Occupational Safety and Health Administration since 1977, and by internal corporate epidemiologists since at least 1948. When Dow Chemical's own study, buried in a file cabinet rather than published in a journal, showed a statistically significant excess of leukemia among exposed employees. The plaintiffs did not need to prove that benzene causes leukemia. That was already established. What they needed to prove was that the company knew it and did nothing. The strange part was not that the chemical had been used. The strange part was that the knowledge had been preserved, stamped with a date, and then allowed to gather dust in a room that had no windows. In the courtroom, the lawyers for the defense had a powerful argument, and it did not rely on denial. It relied on time. They pointed to the latency period itself. If a worker had been exposed in the 1970s, but did not develop leukemia until the 1990s, How could the company be held responsible for risks that were not yet visible at the moment of exposure? The argument was subtle. It did not say that benzene was safe. It said that knowledge of harm is not the same as knowledge of consequence. And because the harm took so long to appear, the company could claim that its own understanding evolved only slowly, that it had acted in good faith, step by step, as the science emerged. But the science had emerged. It had emerged in the 1940s. It had emerged in the Italian shoemakers. It had emerged in the rotogravure printers of the 1930s. And it had emerged inside the industry's own medical departments, in confidential memos that used language like unusual prevalence and cause for concern and further study recommended. The further study had been recommended. Then the further study had been paid for. Then the further study had been filed. And then the further study had been forgotten, not because the data had disappeared, but because the company had no obligation to remember it out loud. The archive does not forget, but the archive can be locked. The workers who sat in the witness chairs in the 1990s were older men. They had rough hands and careful speech. They remembered the smell of the cat crackers at 3 in the morning. They remembered the taste of the air after a turnaround, the period when a unit was shut down for maintenance, and all the residual vapors rose at once, sweet and thick, coating the tongue. They remembered being told to wash their hands with benzene because it removed grease better than soap. They remembered the time a supervisor said, "If you can smell it, it's not too high." They remembered that the company doctor came around once a year and drew blood and said everything looked fine. And then, 15 or 20 or 30 years later, everything did not look fine. The leukemia that came for them was not a sudden event. It arrived as a slow unraveling. First, a tiredness that sleep could not fix. Then a series of infections that the body could not clear. Then a blood test that showed a white cell count that made the hematologist frown and order a second test. Then a diagnosis delivered in a small room with bad lighting, where the doctor used words like blast cells and remission and aggressive. And then the waiting, the long, quiet waiting for the chemotherapy to work or not work, for the insurance forms to be approved or denied, for the lawyers to call back or not call back. By the time a man sat in that witness chair, the refinery where he had worked for 34 years was still standing. The flare stack was still burning. The naphtha still smelled sweet in the evenings. But the statute of limitations on his claim had been calculated from the date of diagnosis, not from the date of exposure. The company's lawyers argued that he should have known sooner, that the link was well publicized by the 1980s, that he had waited too long. The latency that had protected the chemical now worked to protect the company. It was a perfect trap. The same interval that made the disease invisible also made the lawsuit late. Some juries understood, some did not. The verdicts were mixed. In one case, a jury in Texas awarded a former refinery operator $9 million. In another, the judge dismissed the case on summary judgment, ruling that the plaintiff had filed too late. The company did not lose every trial, and it did not settle every claim, but the pattern was consistent enough to force a shift in strategy. By the end of the decade, Exxon and other major refiners had begun to reduce benzene content in their products, not because they had been ordered to, but because the litigation risk had become too expensive to ignore. The market, not the conscience, had moved the needle. There was a kind of justice in that. There was also a kind of tragedy. The men who had been exposed in the 1960s and 1970s were already sick. The men who would be exposed in the 1990s and 2000s would be protected by the very lawsuits that had come too late for the men who filed them. That is the shape of latency in a legal system built on the idea of timely harm. The first generation pays the price of knowledge, and the second generation inherits the regulation. The flare stack still burned at dusk. The naphtha still crossed the fence line, but the barrels of benzene that had once been stored in open tanks were now kept in sealed containers. The vapor recovery systems had been upgraded. The exposure limits had been tightened. And the men who had sat in the witness chairs, who had described the taste of the air after a turnaround, who had watched their own white blood cells disappear under a microscope, they were gone, or they were dying, or they were living on disability checks in houses that still smelled faintly of the refinery, because the smell gets into your clothes and your hair and your skin, and it does not wash out even after the last shift. The long tail of latency does not only delay the disease, it delays the reckoning. By the time a man is sick enough to file a claim, the documents that could prove his case are often lost. The managers who gave the orders are retired. The co-workers who could testify have died or moved away. The photograph of the open tank, the memo about the vapor leak, the safety report that was never written, these things exist only in the memory of a system that has no interest in preserving them. And memory, unlike benzene, degrades. What remains is the smell. The smell of naphtha at dusk, drifting across a chain link fence, carrying no information about what it has already done inside the bodies of the men who breathed it 20 years ago. The smell is innocent. The molecule has no intent. But the molecule has a history, and that history is written in the bone marrow of a generation that is only now beginning to count its dead. In the archive of the body, the exposure is recorded on the day it happens. The body does not wait for the statute of limitations to expire. It remembers everything. But the archive of the company is a different kind of record. Selective, edited, and occasionally sealed. The two archives do not speak the same language, and the courts are left to translate between them with imperfect tools and incomplete texts. The flare stack burns on. The highway at night still carries the faint, sweet scent of a chemistry we have not yet decided how to leave. And in a small office in a city where the petrochemical corridor is just a smell on the evening wind, a legal secretary stamps a filing with a date that will matter or will not matter 40 years from now. That is the long tail of latency. It is still unspooling. There is a moment late at night on an American highway when the traffic thins to a single set of headlights and the asphalt begins to cool. If you step out of the car and stand on the shoulder, you notice something odd about the air. It smells faintly sweet, almost floral, like a garden that has been pressed into a book and left in a drawer for too long. The odor comes from the tires, from the exhaust that has already dispersed, from the gasoline that spilled in drops at the pump hours earlier. It comes from the road itself, which is made with petroleum binders, and from the painted lines, and from the engine you just turned off. The sweet smell is benzene, invisible and undiluted, and it has been there every night of the automotive century. That night, air is an archive. Not a building with shelves and filing cabinets, but a chemical record written into the atmosphere one molecule at a time over 150 years. Every combustion event deposits its signature. Every refinery flare adds a line. Every idling engine at a stoplight contributes a footnote. The atmosphere does not forget, but it does dilute. And dilution, as the chemical industry learned long ago, is the most effective form of disappearance. In 2007, the United States Environmental Protection Agency issued the Mobile Source Air Toxics Rule. The regulation forced refiners to lower the benzene content in gasoline to an average of about 0.6% by volume. This was a significant reduction. Before the rule, typical gasoline contained around 1.3 to 1.6% benzene, and some high-octane blends pushed even higher. The new limit meant that every gallon of fuel pumped into every car, truck, and motorcycle in the country carried roughly half the benzene it once had. It was a victory for public health, arrived at after decades of epidemiological studies, legal battles, and quiet internal memos from companies that had known the risks since the 1940s. But 0.6% is not zero. It is not even close to zero. A fuel tank holds about 15 gallons. Multiply that by the number of vehicles on the road in the United States alone, roughly 290 million, and the arithmetic becomes a kind of dark poetry. Each combustion cycle releases unburned benzene into the exhaust. Each evaporation from the fuel system, each spill at the nozzle, each leak from a corroded underground tank adds to the background. The 2007 rule did not remove benzene from the environment. It reduced the rate at which the archive was written. To understand what 0.6% means in practice, you have to consider how combustion works. When gasoline burns inside an engine, the benzene molecules can behave in two ways. Some undergo complete oxidation into carbon dioxide and water. Others survive the fire intact and exit the cylinder as unburned hydrocarbons, carried out through the tailpipe into the air. The fraction that survives depends on temperature, engine design, fuel mixture, and a dozen other variables, but it is never zero. A modern catalytic converter can strip most of that benzene from the exhaust stream, but not all of it, and not in the first few minutes after a cold start, when the converter has not yet reached its operating temperature. Those first minutes, multiplied by millions of daily commutes, are the moments when the archive grows fastest. The strange part is that the regulation worked by almost any epidemiological measure. Studies conducted after 2007 showed declining benzene concentrations in urban air. The average annual ambient level in major U.S. cities dropped from roughly 3 parts per billion to under 1 part per billion. That sounds like a triumph, and in many ways it was. But 1 part per billion is still a measurable quantity. It is still enough to produce a detectable increase in leukemia risk over a lifetime, according to the models used by the same agency that wrote the rule. The difference between 3 pp and 1 pp is the difference between a known hazard and a managed one. It is not the difference between poison and safety. The archive of air is not uniform. It has local densities and invisible gradients. Drive through a petrochemical corridor along the Gulf Coast of Texas or Louisiana, and the benzene concentration rises. The air around refineries, chemical plants, and loading terminals carries a heavier load. Workers at those facilities still face occupational exposures, though the limits are stricter now than they were in the 1970s. But the line between occupational and ambient blurs at the fence line. Communities that live near refineries breathe air that the EPA classifies as having an elevated lifetime cancer risk. The risk is not dramatic. It is not a plume of poison cloud visible to the naked eye, but it is real, and it is chronic, and it is embedded in the geography of industrial infrastructure. The regulatory history of benzene is a long education in the limits of law. The 2007 rule was not the first attempt to control benzene in gasoline, nor the last. It followed the Clean Air Act amendments of 1990, which required the EPA to regulate mobile source air toxics. It preceded tighter standards for benzene in ambient air that came into effect in 2015. Each new rule closed a door that had been left open, but the building itself, the entire hydrocarbon economy, remained standing. The molecule is too useful, too embedded in the chemistry of combustion and the economics of refining, to be eliminated entirely. The best that regulation can achieve is containment, and containment is always partial. There is a concept in environmental science called the background level. It refers to the concentration of a pollutant that exists in the environment without any local source, the residual amount that has become globally distributed. Before the industrial age, the background level of benzene in the atmosphere was essentially zero. A few natural sources existed: forest fires, volcanic emissions, the metabolic activity of certain plants. But these contributions were trivial. The benzene you could detect in a sample of pre-industrial air, if you had the instruments to measure it, would have been at the edge of detection. Today, the background level of benzene in the northern hemisphere is roughly 0.5 to 1 part per billion. That is the new normal. It is the concentration you will find in the air over a remote island in the Pacific, far from any refinery or highway. It is carried by wind currents that have mixed the emissions of the world into a thin, even haze. The archive has become global. Every breath you take contains a trace of the gasoline burned by someone else, somewhere else, years ago. The molecule does not discriminate between the source and the recipient. It simply circulates. The quiet price of mobility, then, is not something you pay once at the pump. It is something you pay continuously, with each inhalation, in the air that surrounds you wherever you go. The price is small enough to ignore, but not small enough to be zero. Epidemiological models estimate that the lifetime cancer risk from ambient benzene exposure in the United States is on the order of 1 in 100,000 to 1 in a million. That is a low risk by the standards of public health. It is far lower than the risk faced by a worker in a 1940s rotogravure plant. But when you multiply that low risk by hundreds of millions of people, the arithmetic returns a number that is not abstract. It is a number measured in lives. The paradox of the archive is that it is invisible, odorless, at low concentrations, and nearly impossible to avoid. You cannot smell the benzene in the air unless the concentration is many times higher than the background. The sweet floral note that you catch at the edge of a highway at night comes from a transient plume, not the ambient level. You have to be close to the source to detect it. Once the plume disperses, the sensory evidence vanishes. The body, however, does not rely on smell to register exposure. It registers the molecule through other channels: absorption across the lung epithelium, transport into the bloodstream, delivery to the bone marrow, where the chemistry that began in a 19th century laboratory resumes its work. The body keeps its own ledger, and it does not require your awareness to maintain it. The 2007 rule, for all its genuine accomplishment, represents a kind of truce between public health and industrial utility. The reduction was hard-won. The oil industry fought it, arguing that the technology to lower benzene content was too expensive or unavailable. The EPA held firm, with the backing of environmental groups and the families of leukemia victims who had spent years testifying in cold hearing rooms. The rule passed. Benzene and gasoline fell. Ambient concentrations declined. And yet, The underlying structure of dependency, a transportation system built entirely on the combustion of fossil hydrocarbons, remained intact. The benzene was not removed from the fuel, it was merely reduced. The archive of air would continue to be written, only in smaller, more careful script. Consider the journey of a single benzene molecule that leaves the tailpipe of a car on a Tuesday afternoon in 2026. It drifts upward, caught in the turbulence of passing vehicles. It mixes with the exhaust of other cars, the emissions of distant refineries, the residues of cigarette smoke from a driver who cracked the window. It travels east with the prevailing wind, rising and falling with temperature inversions. It crosses county lines, state lines, eventually ocean. It may be absorbed by a leaf, broken down by photochemical reactions, or washed to the ground by rain. Or it may remain in the atmosphere for weeks, circulating, waiting to be inhaled by a person who has never driven a car, who lives in a village far from any highway, who has no connection to the petroleum industry except for the air. That is the archive's deepest irony. The molecule is indifferent to intention. It does not care if you are a refinery worker or a child in a schoolyard a mile from the fence. It does not care if your government passed a law or if your employer followed the rules. It performs the same chemistry in every body it enters, the same metabolic activation, the same formation of reactive intermediates, the same potential to disrupt the orderly production of blood cells. The only variable is dose, and dose is a function of time, proximity, and luck. Late at night, when the highway is empty and the taillights of a lone car disappear into a curve, the air settles. The sweet smell fades as the last traces of exhaust dissipate. The road returns to silence. But the benzene in that air does not disappear. It joins the background, becoming part of the invisible layer that every living thing on the planet now shares. The archive is still being written. It is written by every engine, every pump, every flame, every breath. And the archive does not close, not on its own, not by regulation, not by forgetting. It only grows, molecule by molecule, year by year, until the era that created it has passed, and the air itself becomes the only remaining document of what we did. The sweet smell that first charmed a chemist in a gaslit room never left. It only became quieter, more diffuse, more ordinary. The truth that surfaced through this descent is that the same molecular elegance that made benzene so useful, its stability, its vanishing act, its perfect ring, also made it a slow eraser of bone marrow. The cost was never absent, it was only delayed. 3 images hold the weight of the evidence. The Dow study sitting in a locked file cabinet while workers went home with benzene on their hands. The shoemakers of Milan bleeding into their sheets because the adhesive smelled like almonds. The ambient benzene in the air you breathe on a highway at midnight, so faint it registers as nothing but a trace of sweetness. The archive of exposure is written not in corporate records, but in the marrow of the generation that built the modern world. What became visible is that progress and harm can share the same chemical bond, and that institutions often choose to look away from the bond until the ledger forces them to count. The distance between invention and consequence is measured not in years, but in the silence that fills those years. The body does not forget, it only waits. Now the pressure eases. The darkness above thins to a widening shaft of gray light. The vessel breaks the surface. and the cold sea air carries no trace of the workshop or the refinery. What we brought back from the depth is not the molecule itself, but the understanding of how deeply it entered ordinary life, and how slowly we chose to see it. If this kind of quiet descent into science and history is what you came for, you can subscribe to the Deep Archive. The hatch is open, the air is clear, but the smell of the archive will stay with you.